Three, two, one, and we are live with our first episode of the Marshall Way Network. Welcome everyone that's out there that's watching us this morning on this beautiful Saturday morning. My name is Vishan Borich, and I'm from Branson, Missouri, and I am here today kind of as your host. We have a wonderful panel of very accomplished martial artists that are on the line here today with us. And I'm going to briefly introduce them, and then we're going to go ahead and kick off today's call. And today's episode specifically is the making of a martial artist. And we're going to be sharing with you some specific things such as how do you define the martial way, what separates a fight club from a martial art, how have schools evolved today, and what should you be teaching and learning to be a true practitioner of the martial way. So we're going to get started, and let me introduce our panel that we have here today. All right, so first of all, let's introduce Dr. Leach. This is Dr. Ronald Leach, and if you'll just wave at everybody there, Dr. Leach. And he is a retired dentist, but he's also been extremely active in the martial arts for a very long time. He has a 9th Dan in Shorin-ryu Karate, a 9th Dan in Taekwondo Karate, a 6th Dan in Shurite, a 4th Dan in Kenjutsu and Iijutsu, and a 3rd Dan in Kyokushinkai. And he is also a master instructor in Branson, Missouri. We also have Mr. Richard Osborne, Jr., and if you could just wave at everybody there. Mr. Osborne has an 8th degree in Taekwondo, and he has been practicing Taekwondo since he was a kid, so he's been at it a long time. And he's the owner and chief instructor at Next Level Sport Karate in Springfield, Missouri. All right, then we also have Mr. Sam Roach. Sam, if you could raise your hand, wave at everybody.
Hi, everybody.
All right, Mr. Roach is a 1st Dan in Kyokushinkai, and he really brings something unique because he has been an international student who's lived in South Korea and in Japan, as well as the U.S. So he has traveled and trained in different countries. Currently, he's in the U.S., in Iowa, and he is just an amazing, amazing person and a wonderful practitioner of Kyokushin. All right, then finally, not last but definitely not least, we have Mr. Corey Rose. Wave at everybody, Mr. Rose. Mr. Rose is a 2nd degree in Taekwondo, and he is the owner and chief instructor at Peaceful Warriors Martial Arts in Newcastle, Oklahoma. And we're really looking forward to hearing some of his awesome tips and things that he's done with his school today. All right, so we're going to go ahead and kick off now. The very first thing I'd like to talk about, or actually we're going to have Mr. Osborne talk about, and that is the evolution of the martial arts today, and specifically what he sees for the future. So, Mr. Osborne, if you could go ahead and take it away.
Okay, sounds good. Well, as far as the introduction goes, that's exactly what I want to talk about today. Today's day and time has changed quite dramatically from what we remember it. And again, I know what most of you are thinking. If you're looking at me, you're like, man, that guy looks awful young to know anything about martial arts. Well, that's true. I'm not 21 years old. I'm actually 36. But through research and just being around for the last 30-some plus years, these are some of the observations from the past to the current that I picked up on as far as the evolution of what schools are today, what they were, and how we've gotten to this point. You know, again, I was born in '78, but I really think things started to make a move for the population of martial arts back in the 70s. It seems like with society, that has been the determining factor on what our martial arts schools have looked like, what's being practiced in martial arts schools, and what the focus has been. If you guys will, you know, do anything kind of research or go back through movies or anything that has to do with society, you'll know that back in the 70s we started to see the television series, movies. We started having our first martial arts heroes start to show up back in the late 60s, early 70s. And with that, I think that's where the popularity of martial arts to the mainstream, you know, seemed to start making its way. And so when I say the 70s, and I don't know much about the 70s. Again, I was born in '78, so but that we can all agree that's when Bruce Lee started making his appearance as far as movies go, and the different things that we've had going on to where the popularity of martial arts really started to gain ground or to gain traction. Now, I want to jump into the 80s because to me, I feel like the 80s is probably the golden era of martial arts. I really do. And the main reason why I say that was there was one movie that pretty much changed the industry as far as martial arts go. It's not that there wasn't martial arts business, and I know I don't want to use the two terms martial arts and business, but as far as commercialization of martial arts, the 80s was our boom period. The first thing to hit the mainstream that wanted everybody to be a martial artist was the Karate Kid. When I was very young when that movie came out, my dad was already affiliated with the martial arts. So I already knew I was going that direction, without knowing I was going that direction. I already knew I was going to be in the martial arts. But it seemed like the mainstream media and the rest of the world really paid attention once the Karate Kid came out. Also in the 80s, too, as far as the sport aspect, the martial arts, sometimes we have a division. We have the sport and we have the traditional martial arts. But as far as again, what I'm trying to say as far as evolution goes, the society or what they view as a martial artist seemed to have a huge impact on the 80s. Again, with the Karate Kid. Also, too, ESPN, this new 24-hour sports network started playing martial artists or karate tournaments or kickboxing as a filler. So now you've got people watching baseball, football, and karate. And then you've got the actors that are coming out. You already had Chuck Norris and you already had David Carradine with the Kung Fu series. But now, towards the late 80s, you had, Jean-Claude Van Damme. You had Steven Seagal. You had all this stuff going on in the 80s that really transcended to society. And us as martial arts schools, or from what I've seen, it didn't really change our curriculum. It didn't really make the change that we're going to see probably as I talk in the 90s and in the 2000s. But it seemed like that's where we started this slope of a changing environment as far as martial arts schools go. The one thing that we can all agree on is that prior to the 80s, it's not that children weren't allowed to do martial arts schools. It's just that they were not abundant as they were starting in the 80s. It seems like once children watched the Karate Kid, now the schools became flooded with children. And so now you've got to take your curriculum that you've maybe tailored towards the teens and adults, and now you've got to create kids programs. Now again, the Little Dragons programs, and I'll talk about that later, but now your core base is now not just adults. Now you've got to work in kids. And so now we've got to change in viewing and practicing and how we do things. Even with me when I came up, and if you guys go back to my blog, I kind of give you a synopsis on how I came up as a martial artist. The old days of doing classes, and even what I did when I came up is tame compared to what was in the 60s and 70s. But still, yeah, we still had that kind of old school feel as far as martial arts goes. The hard contact sparring, when I say PT, I mean physical training. I mean, every time we moved, we was doing push-ups or crunches, or we was doing something physically to make that. I mean, and I've told a story, and again, go to my blog. It's one of the best stories I got during a testing one time. The testing wasn't going so good. It's August. It's about 95 degrees outside, and my father turns on the heat just to make sure that we get a little bit extra. Those are kind of the things we did back in the 80s, that would just, it just was a change. We've seen a change coming. So to kind of wrap up the 80s as far as what, I think that is where the change to now, that's where it started, was the 80s, because martial arts became mainstream. It was on ESPN. You had the Karate Kid. You had these actors that were former martial artists that were coming into the fold, and now everybody's eyes were definitely, not that it wasn't on the 70s, but definitely with the 80s, now everybody's eyes started focusing on martial arts. Now, I'll jump into the 90s. It's not that the 90s mirror the 80s, but they're very, very close. In the 90s, you start getting more of a, and we'll go into it now in the 2000s too when I get to that, but the 90s started seeing the advent of what I call the martial arts athlete. So now you've got the traditional martial arts, and you still got traditional schools, because I don't think the 80s, I think our curriculums were all still the same. I mean, we were still teaching base patterns. We were still teaching basics. We were still doing that. We just had an influx of different students and kids that were coming in, and so it was just that our census had changed. It wasn't that what we were teaching had changed. It was just our census. Now you get into the 90s, and now you start seeing the martial arts athletes. Now you start seeing different things. Now, also around, I believe it was 90, 91 is when we first started our introduction in MMA. And for most of us that's been around for a while, MMA, when it first came out, it's not that we didn't wash it away as far as martial artists, but we did not pick up and run with it like it's being done today. And we'll get into that today here in just a little bit. But it doesn't seem like we picked up and ran with it. At the first, it wasn't very organized. It was very bloody, very, very violent. You know, it definitely wasn't like what it looks like today. Not that today's sports is very, not violent, but, it just seems like it was totally different. And as far as martial arts, we almost separate ourselves. We're like, we don't do that kind of stuff, and we don't do that. So the 90s, you started seeing the martial arts athlete. The UFC, MMA started making its appearance. Again, in the 2000s, what I'm getting ready to talk about, that's where the explosion seemed to happen. So the 90s, I say, would mirror the 80s, but then we started seeing the trend. So now you've got martial arts athletes. Now you've got the cage fighting and MMA fights. So now us as martial artists, it's not that we're still not around. Again, 90s I still think was strong for traditional martial arts and still schools like that. It just seems like now we've got more in the fold. Now you've got martial arts athletes. Now you've got these MMA brawling kind of cage fight stuff going on, and now people are starting to look back and go, okay, there's a little bit of hype or there's some activity here with some different things. Now, I would say the explosion or the actual change probably came in the early 2000s. Again, 80s, 90s pretty much mirrored each other, but we had some new stuff coming on. But let's jump into the 2000s. Now, today as martial artists, when I say to somebody, hey, I do martial arts or I do karate, the first thing that they say is, are you UFC, are you MMA, are you cage? And that is not what I am. But because of the popularity, the society, and what people see as martial arts, they believe it's the cage. And so when they look at me and I say martial arts, they're like, hey, are you a cage fighter? I'm like, no, I teach martial arts. So, I feel that is when the time has changed, or that's when the time had come that people don't view us as martial arts anymore. It's more the MMA. Well, it's mixed martial arts. Everything is mixed martial arts now. And it's not so much the case for everybody, but it seems like that seems to be the mainstream right now is the MMA and the cage fights. Also, too, not that our census wasn't young before. We had the Karate Kid, and we had the things going on in the 90s. But now the starting age for a martial artist is around 3 years old. So now we've gotten even younger. We started out young in the 80s and 90s, and now we've got Little Dragons programs. We've got 3- and 4-year-olds. So you've got the MMA cage fighting is really getting big. You've got I've got a little one here, so I'm sorry. But we've got those things happening, and that seems to be the change now. Now you've got the hyper programs as far as martial arts goes. You've got the martial arts athletes making more of a mainstream. Some of the other notices that I've seen with martial arts, I'll try and wrap up, or I could probably talk for an hour on this subject. But one of the things I've also noticed, too, is that you've got the martial arts athletes as far as schools goes. Not that traditional schools aren't still around. I still think they are. But now you've got schools that are primarily sport-oriented. That's all they do is the martial arts athlete. They still belt. They still do those things like that, but they're more focused on the sport aspect of things. The other things that I see as far as the MMA schools is that's all they teach. They teach the grappling and the combat skill and the fighting skill, and that seems to be a mainstream as far as martial arts schools is a lot of that. And then you have martial arts schools that have done a conversion. And what I mean by conversion is they were either Taekwondo, which I'm a Taekwondo stylist, and now they've taken the Taekwondo and they've gotten rid of patterns and forms. Most of us that have came up that have been around for years, we grew up with patterns and forms and katas, and now those systems are starting to take katas out, and they're going to more of a kickboxing, more, it's hard to describe what the schools are, but they still belt, they still look that feel of a martial arts school, but they're taking out patterns, and they've really structured their schools to be a little bit different. So, but I apologize. But yeah, but that's kind of the evolution of what I've seen. And you go to today like that today, I mean, it's totally different. It doesn't look exactly the same. And again, what I'm trying to say is not trying to be negative with today's schools. I'm just saying there's been an evolution and it's changed. I mean, it's changed a lot. And I still believe the traditional schools are out there, and I still think that we're going to thrive because people still seek that. It's just today's atmosphere. It's got so many varieties as it was when we first started coming up. Those varieties weren't there, and now you've got so much out there being offered that it's just a totally different. And I hate to say ball game. I don't want to say a game, but it really has changed for today's society on what we've seen 20, 30 years ago. So.
Hey, thanks so much, Mr. Osborne. I really appreciate you going through kind of the evolution of the art, and that really leads into, what is the purpose of this call. And I neglected to actually introduce myself when I introduced all these wonderful panelists. And I wanted to let you guys know that this show, this Marshall Way Network show, has been a dream of mine for a while. I am a traditionalist. I'm a fifth dan in Shorin-ryu Karate, and also a fifth dan in Kyokushin Kai. And the dream that I have, or that I had, was that I wanted a way to share with other traditionalists, those of us that truly believe that the martial arts is more than just a cage fight, that it's something more intrinsic. It's your mind, it's your body, it's your spirit. It's producing a better person. And for me, the Marshall Way and the purpose of this network is to inspire martial artists, just like you who are watching the show, to train more effectively and to live more vibrantly through the pursuit of the Marshall Way. And for those of you that are maybe new to the whole concept of the Marshall Way to me is a common way of thinking, and it's basically, to simplify it, it's knowledge as a way to improve one's life and the life of others. And that's really the purpose of this call. And we're going to be having these episodes and talking about different topics. We'll even have some guest speakers as well. And speaking of speakers, our next speaker on the agenda today is Mr. Roach. And Mr. Roach is going to discuss what he's been seeing overseas and in Japan, and perhaps share some stories about his experiences. So Mr. Roach, I'm going to toss it to you.
All right, thank you. I'm honored to be here today, and I'm going to kind of jump off what Mr. Osborne was saying earlier about taking out katas and really moving toward a more sports-oriented concept of martial arts. Originally, before I had ever left the country, I had a concept that the real martial arts were in Japan, that real Taekwondo was in Korea. I had these kind of concepts as a kid, kind of growing up. And then once I got there, I realized, or I started to kind of see the bigger picture, that while those arts began in those countries and in Asia, it's really become a global concept and understanding. And what I mean by that is, what someone thinks of the martial arts in America and what someone thinks of martial arts in Japan may actually be very similar. If I say that I do karate to a person in Japan, some of the first things that are going to pop into their mind are competitions, tournaments, and that's generally speaking. But when I went to Japan, I once had the opportunity to join a kind of karate class. I was actually with my girlfriend, and we were downstairs in this building with a Chinese class, a group of people who wanted to learn Chinese in their free time. And I started hearing some yelling and kind of stomping upstairs, so I went to go investigate, and I found out that they have a karate class going on upstairs. And I asked if I could join their next class, the adult class, and check things out, and they said sure. So I ran back home, I got my gi, and I joined their class. And when I went in, from the minute that I went in with my girlfriend, she was helping to translate and just kind of introduce me and everything. When I went in, he started talking. And from the time that I went in to the time that I left, he was talking pretty much the whole time. And he was talking to my girlfriend, he was talking to me, and he literally said that the majority of what we would call karate or martial arts today in Japan, the traditional stuff, the Budo, he said it's gone. They don't do katas. He said that the tradition itself lives on in America. That what people do in America is closer to the real tradition of Budo and martial arts. And that's not true as a generalization. There's still traditional schools, plenty of traditional schools in places like Korea and Japan. But I think that that's the overall view of a lot of people. So they didn't have katas. Most of the class was hitting bags and doing combinations, and then sparring. But I do want to talk a little bit about tradition, because I think tradition is not something that is static. It's not something that's old, necessarily. Tradition is something that changes, just like everything else. Tradition changes and evolves, and it stays relevant to modern times. I think the word tradition implies that something has withstood the test of time and come and is still applicable and relevant in today's society. So on that note, I also went to the judo club in Korea, and the atmosphere was still very a lot more sort of loose and relaxed than what I was used to coming from a traditional background. But I noticed that the instructor there was very, very humble. He's probably one of the best examples of a martial artist that I've ever met. And he was being kind of looked at as a potential Olympic candidate. So there's still the kind of competition-oriented aspect there, but I felt that there was much more humility and a respect for what they were doing. Now there are places like the Shudokan. There are places in Okinawa. You have people like Master Morio Higaonna and various people who are carrying on the traditional aspects of martial arts. But I think that what we have in America in some traditional schools is not too far deviated from what a traditional school might look like in Japan or Korea. I think that wraps up my talk there.
All right, thanks so much, Mr. Roach. That was really great to hear your perspective on what you've been seeing overseas. I really appreciate that. So next up, we have Dr. Leach, and Dr. Leach, I'd like him to discuss the martial way and what really separates a fight club from a martial art. And he's also going to talk on a few specific points that he believes that martial arts schools should consist of to be considered a practitioner of the way. So, Dr. Leach, if you could go ahead and unmute and take it away.
Okay, thank you. I lost my connection here before, and it took me a while to get it back up. I basically want to concern my comments here to really what we should be teaching in the martial arts. And I think, as with anything, is this proper there? Okay. As with anything, I think we need to really work on what are our basics. That is the whole crux of your art, whatever you're teaching. And if your students don't know good basics, they're not going to learn a good art. But the basics consist, first of all, proper stances and the proper depth, width, and length of the stance. And this will vary by individual size, and it will vary from school to school and art from art in the depth and the type of stances that you use. We relate the stances to body proportion and using shoulder width as the basis for the stance. And that way people get a good stance and one that's usable with their body style. It has to be consistent with your style, though. That's important. Some styles use a very low stance, and you know, these aren't going to be proportionate to your body. But you need to be able also to teach your students in their walking through their stances to be flowing and moving smoothly. That's very important. As far as it goes with blocks and punches, the first thing you need to teach the student how to make a proper fist. And this varies also, again, according to the art. We've developed the techniques that we have through the use of physiology and really physics in some cases to improve what we have and how we do techniques. The kata is important as well. Proper starting points and stopping points for every kata should be the same. A kata starts and it stops at the same point. And this way, you know that your stances are good and that everything is working the way it should. Proper starting point and ending point of a particular block or punch is also important. Your students are not taught how to bring something to a definite point, then their blocks and punches are going to be sloppy. If you get out in the street and have to use something like this, you're going to find that your blocks won't be effective. We also teach the proper rotations of muscles. I teach my students the names of these muscles and how they work in the rotation of the punch, which muscles are included and why we rotate that punch. It's extremely important that they know that, and they can feel this as you know, you put your hand on the particular muscles as you do the punch or block, and you can actually feel which muscles are working and which ones aren't. And the more muscles you get working on an individual technique, the stronger your technique is going to be. But in addition to that, the technique has in what is called a framed position. Now, I got this this word from Troy Rice. Teaches framing. I first ran across it in some Chinese systems, and it made sense to me. And Troy Rice's explanation was excellent. You know, this is the kind of instruction that you want to get. So if things are properly rotating and functioning, where they end, where they stop, and what you expect to do out of each thing. Within the kata themselves, the bunkai, the actual function of every technique, students need to know this. They need to know how a technique works. They need to know what it's going to do and why it does it. Then you can add the oil, the way you can soup these things up and make them more effective. You know, you can do things in techniques to do this. These are important things that the student must know. Now, also, one thing I want to really talk about is vital points, and I'm not talking about the Kyosho Jutsu type of vital points, things that are used in Chinese medicine. I'm talking about a direct cause and relationship. If you strike a bone, and you break it, what's going to happen? For example, if you break the collarbone right here, what's going to happen? What's going to happen to that big artery and vein underneath there? Or if you don't know about it, then you should be knowing about it. Same in the temple. What happens if you break the temple? What's below that bone if you break that bone? They need to know the location of every vital point that they're going to strike. And by striking at these vital points, they need to know the cause and effect and what's going to happen by hitting this point. And that result has some major implications about what happens to your opponent. Also, I think students need not only to know how to use their martial arts properly and do the techniques properly and do them well, and by doing this they can be very dangerous people, but they also need to know some non-invasive control techniques and non-invasive attacks. We need to have a balance of these things. Someone throws a punch at you on the street and he's drunk, and you kick him in the head and kill him. That's going to be real hard to explain to the judge. Even if you just injure him severely, if you kicked him in the head, you've got a problem. On the other hand, if you have a control technique, small circle jiu-jitsu is a good example of control techniques in which you can control people to a very good extent and not actually injure them. Some other things that we need to teach also, especially, are temperament. That is, we need to deal with the ego, we need to deal with confidence, and we need to deal with humility. Now, ego and confidence together without proper technique is really a danger for oneself. If you get in a situation, you have lots of ego, lots of confidence, and you don't know what you're doing, you're going to get hurt. On the other hand, ego and confidence with technique is kind of a danger to other people, in that you use these techniques to the fullest extent because you know you can and you do, you can end up in trouble. On the other hand, combining humility with confidence allows one to have self-control over what they are doing and what techniques they use and how they function within their system and outside their system, so that they know exactly what's going to happen to them or to their opponent when they do this. Now, I'm just going to leave you with a definition of humility, and I heard that word mentioned here before. Humility is a serene state of mind exhibiting non-judgmental tolerance and understanding with a modest opinion or estimate of one's own importance. If we run humility through our whole system, you're going to have a better martial arts. And this isn't necessarily telling your students they got to be humble. You have to teach this by example. And you teach by example every day in class and every time you talk with a student. And if you teach ego, that's something else. I saw something on the internet, Facebook today. Kind of interesting. Somebody was commending a martial artist for 50 years in the martial arts, which has come along 50 years. One of the comments was, well, congratulations on your 50 years. I've been teaching longer than you've been doing the martial arts. I wonder where the humility was in that statement. So I found it kind of interesting that I looked up this person. Must have been taken at quite a young age. So humility, a serene state of mind exhibiting non-judgmental tolerance and understanding with a modest opinion of or estimate of one's own importance. And I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you. Back to you.
There we go. I was having trouble getting me off mute, but thank you very much, Dr. Leach. I really like that definition of humility, and you're right, that's such an important part of finding a martial arts school. Or if for those of you that are instructors that are on watching the show today, if you yourself have noticed when you look internally that you're not demonstrating humility and honor with your students, that really leads into what we're going to talk about next. And Mr. Rose is going to be sharing some ideas and tips on what he has been doing at his own school and also his personal philosophy on this. So, Mr. Rose, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you guys hear me okay? Oh, okay. I'm sorry, didn't see that. Before I answer that question, I'm hearing a lot of good points get made, and Dr. Leach, for example, made a couple of points that hit home with me really big. I'm one of those people that I always like to talk about, or when we teach, not just the how of a technique, but the why. Why do we twist it like this? Why does it have to be at this angle? Why does it have to work like this? And of course, I encourage that we play with those different things, but the why and when and the vital zones. Right now, I am personally nursing a cracked rib on my right side, and for any of you guys that know the physiology behind that, what I took is what a lot of boxers refer to as a liver punch. And it's amazing what that does to the body. It can actually, in rare cases, it can be fatal, causing internal bleeding. And when you get hit there, it instantly causes your blood pressure to drop to near nothing, and it makes your legs collapse. That's why boxers call it a knockout punch. So having knowledge of physiology and knowledge of the effect your strike can have based on where you put it, I think is very important, whether in a fight perspective, a sport perspective, or a self-defense perspective. All right, and I know we've been talking about, I know Mr. Osborne Jr., he brought up MMA, for example, and I get asked the same all the time, you know, are you a cage fighter? When I went to the hospital for my rib, that was the first thing they asked me. And I say, no, I'm not a cage fighter, but, you know, that kind of messes with us in our curriculum, because we're not technically a sports school, but some might not look at us as more of a traditional school either. We allow our students to compete if they want to in any type of competition they want to compete in, whether it's Kyokushin competitions, Olympic Taekwondo competitions, open competitions, point sparring, whatever. But we practice a wide array of things, from non-aggressive techniques, joint lock defense, grappling defense, ground defense, and the striking game. So in a way, what we do is mixed martial arts. I have a background. I only have a black belt in Taekwondo, but I do have a background in other styles and different things. That's what our curriculum is based on. But it's hard for me to say, well, we do mixed styles, because everybody instantly thinks MMA. I know Master Osborne hit on that. So about being a martial artist, I don't think under the term of definition, or the definition of it for me personally, I don't think it really matters whether you're a sports school or even an MMA school or a more traditional school. To me, what makes a martial artist over like just another fighter really is it's a core strength of character that comes from knowing, you know, who you really are on a deep level, and the ability to constantly be learning about yourself on a deep level, and to try to become the absolute epitome of those values, those ethics, and those morals that we see as being important to ourselves and important to making a difference in the world. Being the example, as Dr. Leach already said, you know, as a teacher, to teach these things, the most important aspect is to be the example yourself, constantly be reevaluating yourself on the inside. I'm a proponent of meditation. I'm one of those guys that I like to talk about meditation a lot, as far as learning about yourself and learning to quiet your mind down so you can slowly start to see more about yourself than you ever saw before. But, you know, martial artist to me, someone who's learning to not just fight with their body, but learning to blend their mind, their body, and their spirit. That's something that's often forgot, together in a balance that builds not just a fighter, but an unbreakable character about a person, a character that adheres to their particular code of ethics and values no matter what. I know a lot of people define that as a warrior, but to me, a martial artist is a warrior. I think you can't talk about one without really talking about the other. You know, many people today kind of use the excuse that it's impossible in today's society to live by certain codes. It's impossible. Society makes it impossible for me to be honest all the time. Makes it impossible for me to have integrity and keep my word all the time. Those things, it's just not true. But it's something that you have to make a choice. As an individual, you have to choose that you're going to live that way, and you have to consciously continue to make that choice. And every moment of every day, every time you're faced with a decision, you have to continue to make that choice that fits, you know, in your values. So again, it has to start with a conscious choice. To me, a martial artist isn't just somebody who fights or knows how to fight. It's not just somebody who knows how to defend themselves, but it's someone who has the ability to make peaceful choices to situations wherever possible, not out of the necessity, not out of personal safety, but out of the fact that of the knowledge of that violence is a last resort. It's not something that's actually going to solve the issue at hand. And it's also somebody who, we talk about this, the name of my school is Peaceful Warriors, so we talk about this in relation to a warrior a lot, not necessarily someone who fights, but someone who, if they have the capacity to help somebody else, you know, will do so to the best of their ability. Someone who continually keeps growing their own knowledge, but not just for themselves, but also sharing it with others, and remembering that they can learn from everybody. I mean, one of my favorite quotes, I'm going to butcher this, but it was something I wrote in a journal a few years ago, and I keep going back to, is everybody in this world holds a piece of the puzzle. You know, just a tiny, tiny piece. And if you pass somebody off as someone you don't like, or just being ignorant, or you refuse to learn from them, then you're missing out. You're missing out on a piece of that puzzle. You're also missing out on the opportunity to share your knowledge with others, to help them on their own path. So again, when you're talking about teaching people, you're talking about teaching a code of ethics or morals, it's kind of a tricky subject. Again, you have to start with being the example yourself. You really have to constantly be reevaluating yourself and how you deal with your students, how you deal with other people all the time. And I don't just mean in your school or in your dojo or your dojang. I mean at the store. I mean at home. I mean literally everywhere you go. Are you truly living this, or is this just something that you preach for 2 hours a day? You know, that sort of thing. And then especially when we look at things like honor and respect in particular, honor and respect are things, I think we all realize this, are things that are both given and earned, but neither one are things that can truly be demanded. If you demand respect, then in my mind you're confusing fear with the concept of respect, and those are two totally different things. Again, when you talk about honor, I think we talk about having honor a lot. We talk about living with honor a lot as martial artists, but I think what we really are referencing here is living an honorable life, or living in an honorable fashion. If we start to demand honor from others, that in its own right is selfish in its own right, and therefore, by definition, not honorable. So those are things that all have to come down to a choice, to the way you want to live. And we all know, and I wrote about this in one of my blogs about spirituality, if you've ever tried to teach, you know that just telling someone how to live, or kind of preaching to them that these are the decisions you should make, it's always going to fall on deaf ears. People tend to tune that out. It's always been one of my biggest issues with political debates. I think a lot of us have been on Facebook, social media during presidential elections, during things like that. I do get involved in some of those discussions sometimes, but I hate to, because it always resorts to name calling. It always resorts to somebody being rude, somebody making some nasty remarks. But the thing is if you truly believe that your standpoint and your way of doing this, guy would think that your job is to convince this guy to vote your way as well. Well, you're not going to do that by calling him names. You're not going to do that by calling him stupid. You're not going to do that by calling him dumb. In fact, you're going to reiterate his own point to him in his mind. That's not going to change anybody's mind. Nobody likes to be spoken to like that, and no one is going to be receptive to that type of teaching. So that's where, you know, it gets a little difficult to teach sometimes. But like I say, the most important thing is to be the example. Often it starts with a personal experience. Realistically, when you have a student that starts to understand this, so you say something to them, maybe they do something, it really clicks with them, then it comes down to once they start living with honesty or integrity, they start focusing on one thing, everything else starts to fall into place. Self-control, anything you practice, self-control becomes an involvement in. Discipline becomes an involvement in. Goal setting becomes an involvement in. So once one starts, it's like the rest spreads by wildfire. Now, one of the ways that I like to do this at my school, we use a Word of the Month program that I started myself here. And what I do with that is I'll take a word that we're going to talk about over a particular month, and before the month starts, I will, whether I know the definition or not, I will sit down and I will look it up in the dictionary and I will write it down, word for word, exactly what the dictionary says that word means. Then I'll forget it, and on a different piece of paper, I'll write down what other people assume the word means, or what we used it, and we see it used in context a lot. I'll even go ask people, hey, if I say the word integrity to you, what does that make you think of? If I say the word honesty, what does it make you think of? And then I spend some time meditating on all those aspects, and I come up with real life examples that are very common situations, both for kids, and then I find some others for adults, of ways that we can practice making conscious decisions to live a nice, fancy worded piece of paper that becomes an optional part of our program. It's not something I make our students do, but it's there for them if they want. They can earn a patch for doing their homework and stuff like that, and it's all opinion based. But with that, what we do is whatever the word of the month is, we say it every time we bow. And yes, we have a 3 to 6 year old program, we have a young kids program, and then we have everybody else. But everybody, every time you bow in the school, every time you bow when you walk in the door, every time you bow when you get on the mat, every time you bow off the mat, every time you bow to your partner, every time you bow to the oath, you yell the word of the month loudly. We like to be loud here. But it's that constant reminder of what it is that we're thinking of at that particular time, what it is that we're supposed to be working on. And then through that month, I'll split it down to weeks. And I'll think, okay, this is a point I want to make in week 1. This is a point I want to make in week 2. And it's something I try not to talk about it much because, like I said, preaching it doesn't do it. So instead, I try to use subtle reminders along with the drills we're doing. Or another way I like to do it is through challenges. I love to give challenges to people because most people love challenges. Most people want to see if they can really do it. So let me give you an example. I put one on my second blog post with Marshall Way. It's one I give twice a year. I give it during self-control month, and I usually give it again during discipline month. And it's to try to go through the entire month that every time you feel yourself getting mad or upset, angry or sad, try to stop yourself before you react and give yourself 20 or 30 push-ups. Doesn't matter where you are. Do it in the store, pull a car over on the side of the highway. Don't care where you are. When you're mad, stop and do 30 push-ups, period. And I tell the kids, like, you can imagine it's me standing over you, yelling, 30 push-ups now, and get them going. And by the end of the month, see what it is they learned about themselves. Now, I have a lot of adults that have taken this challenge, that have actually done this, and came back to me. And the amazing thing is, they always say, as I'm getting up, as I'm resting, as I'm catching my breath, whatever, I start to think about, why was I mad? Why was I upset? Why was I feeling that way? Is it really that important? Is there anything I could actually do about it or not? And start looking at things in a more productive manner, which helps them to calm down. And I've had a couple students tell me they never realized how much energy they wasted on negativity, how much energy they wasted on being negative and getting angry at things that shouldn't ever been an issue, things you shouldn't even bother to get mad at. But you walk around the store anywhere and you see the same thing. You walk around the mall and you see it in people. You kind of see that negativity. And so all I try to do is make it where people start to see that in themselves. And so in that, 1, they're practicing self-control and they're learning more about themselves. And 2, if their self-control doesn't improve, they get way stronger and way more fit because they're doing 1,000 push-ups a day. So works either way there. Another one I like to do, we do Perseverance Month, and this is a fun one. Kids and adults both loves this one. We do what I've called perseverance kicks. So for you video game fans, this is basically a Mortal Kombat game, Liu Kang's bicycle kick. It's how many front kicks can you throw in a single jump. I know it's a little goofy, but it's one of those things that's like even our most basic students can throw a front kick and generally can jump. So it becomes okay, well, that's it. Now just keep trying. The harder you try, the more you persevere, the more times you get up from you fall, the better you do. This is our C class, the beginning of every class. And this is our second year doing it, and some of these guys amaze me. I've got a few guys that can hit 7 and 8 touches on the bag before they fall. It's really, really quite amazing. But, you know, I do it with all kinds of things. I got something like we use a split kick or a twin jump front kick for our goals month and talk about how to break down the goals. So we learn how to jump. We learn how to jump tuck. We learn how to jump and tuck to the outside. Then we learn how to throw the kick. Breaking down goals. When we're working on courtesy, honor, respect, I like to work a lot of partner drills during those months because we always talk about having enough courtesy for your partner that you're not trying to hurt them, you're not going to do anything to purposely hurt them, but have enough respect for them as well to push their limits so that they get better. No one's getting better if we're just going completely halfway all the time. Honesty challenge, I do an honesty challenge too that basically is kind of a don't open your mouth all month unless you're pretty sure what you're saying is true. I know that's one that's kind of difficult, but we've had some people try it, and it's it's worked really well. So again, I like to give challenges to people. It tends to help out, and in this way, it's like I'm constantly reminding students of an ideal, of a moral, of an ethic, constantly reminding myself of it. But I'm not telling anybody you have to do it. I just leave it out there for them, and over time I usually start having a student, once they've been with me 3 months, 6 months, or sometimes in the first couple of weeks, come up to me and they start talking about personal experience from the past. So why suddenly the idea of integrity is resonating with them, or the idea with honesty is resonating with them in a way that they never thought before, because somebody cheated them in the past or somebody lied to them in the past in a certain way. And that's all it takes to start, and it's something that I believe can be done with or for everybody, and it's kind of that starting point that differentiates a lot of fighters and a lot of average people from martial artists. Another way we go about this, again, is once you get with that point, you got to keep up with your students in a one-on-one basis. I do this, especially if you see one that's down or having a hard time in class lately. I like to use, like I said earlier, I like to use personal examples. I like to tell personal stories. If I don't have a personal example that relates to your situation, I'll use parables. A lot of my students have dubbed it story time with Mr. O. So I say, well, story time with Mr. O. True, I have one about Halloween and a bunch of other different ones to try to make someone in that class feel better about something that they're going through. And then, using encouragement. You have to constantly encourage them to be different, to make those changes, and if they feel bad because they make a mistake, to continue to keep trying. The same thing when we're talking about technique. Oh, excuse me. Or talking about learning new technique. And one of the ways I do that on a personal level, sometimes I do phone calls, sometimes I just do emails. Christmas and birthday cards. I know a lot of us do Christmas and birthday cards for our students. I do mine handwritten. Oh, it takes me hours, yes, but I sit there and I handwrite a personal note to each and every one of my students to try to help encourage them on their own personal path. Once a person catches on to one principle, the rest kind of start to fall in line. Then, over time, I start to also use a principle, because sometimes we have students that don't know, that never really catch on to something that's important to them to help kind of start that fire. So one of the things we use a principle, I'm sure there's other terms for it. I've always called it the unfocused focus. And this is something you kind of push through in sparring practice. When there's a threat in front of us, I think a lot of us have been through this many times, when there's a threat in front of us, after a certain amount of time, tactics kind of go out the window a little bit. Not to say that you get necessarily sloppy, but you kind of let everything take over, and pretty soon you're not 100% focused. You suddenly feel really calm, you're really relaxed, and yet you seem to almost be able to preempt what your partner's doing. I think we've all seen students kind of have those breakthrough moments like that when they're sparring, those relaxed moments. And I like to encourage, when I see someone going through that and I see it and I can always tell, it'd be like their back is turned and somehow they seem to magically know a strike was coming, that sort of thing. And I take those and I encourage those moments, and then I talk about learning to switch that on and off even when, which is something we talk about in meditation, because in that time where that threat is there, you're not thinking about what you're going to have for dinner that night. You're not thinking about what just happened 10 minutes ago. You're only in that moment. There's no split second ahead. There's no split second behind. You're right in that moment. And so it's something we talk about with meditation too. But then I talk about trying to learn how to be like that when there's not a threat present. So we work that down to doing katas and forms. I'm a huge traditional kata and form fan. I really big on it here. We hammer it really hard here, and I'm not sure, I can't remember the bunkai, the Japanese term for it. We're huge on working on things like that and the uses for techniques and forms and all that. But I'm also huge on making my students nervous. So we do big public testings. We do massive testings with 100, 200 people here between the testers and the people watching, family, friends, and everything else. And to make people nervous on purpose and get them to get up there and do their things on their own. And it's one of the ways that we judge how they're dealing with their anxiety. And we talk about dealing with anxiety through breath control, martial arts breathing. We also talk about through this unfocused focus, this kind of turning off the past, the future, kind of tuning certain things out. And you can always see it. I think a lot of us have judged at tournament, and you see that one that's just a little bit different from everybody else. After they've done their introduction or whatever they do, their eyes kind of glaze over. They look past you. They're not even looking at anything anymore, and they just nail their stuff, and they just go through it. And to me, that shows an ability to be able to turn that on and off. But getting down to a point, sorry, I'm rambling a little bit. I have a habit of doing that. Getting down to the point of promoting this in my students is so some of my students that maybe have not realized what's important to them or haven't come to a core value set yet. I mean, it's a slightly different for everybody, but it all kind of fits under the same umbrella. Then if I can get them to that point and I can encourage that point, then they start looking at things differently. They quit looking at things with that natural shadow the ego casts over our own mistakes and over our own issues and problems. They start to learn way more about themselves, and they have the ability then to start seeing more into their own core values. So to me, whether I have 5 students in class or I have 100 students in class, I still try to make it a personal level, even if it's just for 2 or 3 people in a large group, but you never know how many others that could affect at the time. But trying to keep that personal level for everybody. Everybody's individual growth is different. I know the original Buddha, used to talk about that. Nobody walks the same path. Or if you meet Buddha on the path, kill him. That's what they used to say. Everybody's path is different. So I try to take it on as much of an individualistic approach as possible. But most people tend to do best finding these things on their own. So what it really all comes down to as a teacher, be the example. Show people that it can be done. The society cannot break you down where you can't live that way. So once and then as the example, don't tell people how to live. Guide them. Guide them to make that choice themselves. Guide them to a situation where they start to feel like it's important to them, and guide them to that point where they start to have the same conviction about living that way as you do, and they start to see it as important. So anytime, so again, just to recap, anytime something's forced, it's never gonna go over well. It's something that's got to be guided. I ended, I'm going to butcher this quote too, but I ended one of my blog posts with a quote about how the way the river carves a mountain. It's slow and it's subtle, and sometimes in the way that happens, it takes a very, very long time, but it gets the job done in a much better fashion, in my opinion, than dynamite would in just blowing up the whole mountain. So hopefully that's helpful to some of you guys. I'm sorry, I tend to talk a long time. I tend to ramble. So I'll give it back to you, Ms. Porch.
Thank you, Mr. Rose. Those are some really great golden nuggets there that you shared. For those of you that are instructors on the call, I hope you were taking some notes. And for those of you that are students or just delving into the martial arts, I hope that you found our first episode to be enlightening for you and in your journey as a martial artist. I was checking the chat. I only saw one question, but towards the end of the call, and this will be for future episodes as well, if you who are listeners out there have questions or you want to be a part of our episode, our live episode, make sure you log in below. You'll see the live fire chat window. It's free to register, and you can type in questions or comments, whatever you'd like in there, and one of us will reply back to you on that, or even shout it out on the live call so that you can be a part of our conversation. So with that, we're going to go ahead and put a bow on it because we're already past the hour here. But I wanted to thank all of our panelists that have been on the call today. Thank you for all the words of wisdom and advice that you gave to all of us on this show. And just to remind you, we will be doing these calls frequently, these episodes. Our next episode is going to be on February the 13th, so Friday. We're going to do it on a Friday. A few of us have some things that we're committed to on the 14th for Valentine's Day. So expect to get an invitation if you're registered for 8 p.m. Central Time, 9 p.m. Eastern Time on Friday, February the 13th for our next live episode. And with that, we'll close up, and thanks again for watching.